And I certainly remember during the Troubles travelling up the north, and you go 2 hours up the road and suddenly there's armed soldiers and tanks and checkpoints, and it just seemed so far away and yet so close. And I think a lot of people down south really gave very little thought to the north.
I just knew that if there was a vote for Brexit, there was going to be a profound shift in something. I wasn't quite sure what. But then the day after the referendum, Martin McGuinness called for a border poll. And for the first time in my life, I thought, this is it. We're actually on the countdown now.
Hi, it's Martin Nutty, and you're listening to the Irish Stew podcast. That first voice you heard was acclaimed documentary filmmaker Alan Gilsenan, director of The Irish Question. The second voice was that of renowned journalist John Walsh and writer of The Irish Question. That film explores the recent history of Ireland, the partition between North and South, and what a united Ireland might look like. This episode was recorded at the Capital Irish Film Festival. A big thank you to Solas Nua, Washington DC's wonderful Irish arts organisation, hosts of the festival, who kindly invited me to record 4 episodes featuring some of the best work of contemporary Irish filmmakers, all ably curated by Maeve McCullough. Finally, you'll notice the absence of my co-host John Lee in these episodes. Sadly, John's older brother, Daniel Lee, passed away shortly before our DC departure. Dan had suffered through a long illness, but the end came abruptly. He was a lifelong educator and leader in independent school education. John tells me Dan's nickname in the family was the Irish King, and so these episodes have been made in the Irish King's memory. May he rest in peace. Now let's hear from Alan Gilsenan and John Walsh.
Delighted to welcome both John Walsh and Alan Gilsenan to Irish Stew. Appreciate you taking the time out. We're sitting right next door to Washington, D.C. at the Capital Irish Film Festival on the first day of March. And I'd just like a little bit of background for our listeners that maybe don't know about both your extensive careers. And then we'll talk about coming together. Now, I understand, Alan, you're a quasi-Dubliner / Meath man.
I'm a filmmaker. I was born in County Meath on a farm. Mm-hmm. My father always made sure I was very clear on that, but we moved to Dublin when I was very young. Mm-hmm. So I grew up basically in Ballsbridge on the legendary Raglan Road, and now live out in Wicklow.
Not old enough to have encountered Paddy Cow?
No, I don't think so, but funnily I made a film recently called The Ghosts of Agatonia, which is a kind of slightly autobiographical kind of indulgence on my part about the area and the ghosts of the area. And a quite poetic thing, very different to the Irish Question. And at one point I realised that I was talking in interviews about being a child and meeting Patrick Kavanagh with my father, which I have a very vivid image of, walking down Pembroke Road and my father stopping to talk to Patrick Kavanagh, who lived there, and me bored and swinging out of a railing. But then when I excavated that memory, I realised that can't have happened. That I must have just invented that somewhere. So the bottom line is you can't really depend on me. John is a hugely respected journalist, so he's a lot more coherent and dependable than I am on matters of fact.
Speaking of matters of fact, what's your factual origin story?
I'm from East Cork, Youghal, a town in East Cork originally. I studied in ECC, and then from there I went to London. And in London I trained as a journalist and lived there until from 98 to 2005, and then moved back to Dublin. So I've been in Dublin now for 20 years. Most of that time I was a staff journalist, most recently with the Times. That's the Irish edition of the London Times. And then for the past years, I've been mostly freelance while working on projects. So this is the first documentary. When I was in London, I worked for Panorama, doing research on a freelance basis. But really, this is the first time I've worked in a documentary. My first one being a really enjoyable experience.
I'm always interested in talking to Irish people that have had an expat experience and how that coloured your view of Ireland, living offshore for a while. Now, I know Britain is close, but it's still a different place. And how did that shift your thinking about the country?
I was there at a very interesting time. I'd been there before that as a student, and when I was there as a student, the IRA campaign was still ongoing. So there was that sense of being Irish. There was a view in England about Irish people. And it wasn't just that. Obviously, up to the mid-90s, the economy would have been very underdeveloped. So that very much shaped British attitudes to Irish people. I moved there in 98. So I lived my entire time under New Labour, Tony Blair's Labour. And it was a completely different experience for a few reasons. One, obviously, the Good Friday Agreement had just been signed. So that kind of put the whole, obviously the IRA thing went into the background largely. But it also coincided with the rapid development of the Irish economy. And where I worked as a trainee journalist, there was a guy, I sat across from this guy, his father was Jeremy Hanley, who had been the former chairman of the Conservative Party. And he was a real public school boy. Very nice guy with certain views and perceptions of Ireland that were just innate. And it came up on the BBC website that Irish GDP per capita had surpassed Britain for the first time ever. And I can remember him looking at me with almost a sense of betrayal, or just couldn't understand it. I mean, the whole experience of being Irish during, certainly my period in London, changed very much. We were no longer seen as economic refugees. Generally, if you were in London, you were there by choice. So it was almost, we became those, a bit like Australians and Kiwis and all that, spending a bit of time in London, not the experience that generations before me would have had. And also, leading up to what we're doing now, and from the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, there was almost this sense that Northern Ireland has been resolved. You know, we can go back to forgetting about it. I always found one thing, and it was something I insisted on when I was talking to English people in particular, when they asked me about what was happening in Northern Ireland, I'd always say, don't you find it strange that you're asking me about something that's happening in your country? And there was always this sort of, oh yeah, I know it's ours, but it isn't really. Yeah, that was my experience of it.
Yeah. My recollection, I don't know what our relative ages are, but I was born in 64, so I'm 60 right now. Growing up as a young person around, recalling being on the butt end of English jokes. To be Irish was to be backward, to be made fun of. And it's interesting because I think you charted that transition from that was no longer part of the dialogue and that shift had taken place. But let's talk a bit about the Irish Question, your documentary, which I've had the pleasure of seeing in your collaboration. When did you both intersect with each other?
I think John contacted me out of the blue. We didn't know each other, I think. Said he had an idea. So we met for a cup of coffee in Leary, and I hope this isn't like my Kavanagh story. I'm making this up. Anyway.
That wasn't me.
In my memory, met John, we had a coffee. It was just in the wake of kind of Brexit, and John was saying, basically, not to paraphrase him in front of him, but that basically Britain had sort of sleepwalked into Brexit. They voted emotionally. They hadn't really thought about it, probably. A lot of people thought it wouldn't happen. It did happen. It was going to have and has had very serious repercussions for Britain, obviously. And that there was a possibility, as the thoughts of a border poll was emerging in Ireland and becoming more prevalent with the political rise of Sinn Féin, that we could do the same, that we hadn't really thought about it. And when he said that, of course, I absolutely agreed. It seemed like an obvious thing. John had done a lot of thought in it, and I realised that I didn't feel the country had. I would have had always a kind of slightly, I think a lot of people, a romantic aspiration to unite Ireland. my grandfather was in the Irish Parliamentary Party, so, you know, I would have distantly grown up in that democratic nationalist, constitutional nationalist tradition, and kind of vaguely thought the idea of a united Ireland was a nice thing sometime in the future. And then I suppose my conversation with John provoked a lot of questions that I didn't have the answer for, and I thought the Irish public didn't have an answer. And so that was the start of the film, really. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think for me, the whole, not necessarily a film, but the reason why we're here, it started with Brexit. It was actually like precisely a week before the Brexit referendum. I was working as a journalist at the time, and was with somebody at an Irish official level who'd been responsible for scoping out the consequences of, if there was a Brexit, what would be the implications for Ireland. So, I mean, it was off the record, I can't say who we met in a hotel in Dublin, and he'd obviously, at that stage, he'd been part of a team who'd been looking at Brexit for about 2 or 3 months. They'd quite in-depth knowledge of the implications. So he went through it, and basically the upshot would be that if there was a vote for Brexit, the implications for the border, the Good Friday Agreement, everything to do with the peace process, it would have profound implications. And what was also very obvious is that none of this had been considered in the UK, in the referendum itself, by either the Leave side or the Remain. In fact, what really sticks out in my mind is about 2 or 3 days before the referendum, there was a reporter from Irish Radio, went on the campaign trail with Nigel Farage, one of the most prominent Brexiteers, and he said, about the implications for Ireland and the peace process. And he said, don't worry, we'll still buy your Guinness. And that was it. That was the level they were at. I just knew that if there was a vote for Brexit, there was going to be a profound shift in something. I wasn't quite sure what. But then the day after the referendum, Martin McGuinness called for a border poll. And for the first time in my life, I thought, this is it. We're actually on the countdown now. And then that summer, the summer of 2016, it wasn't just Sinn Féin talking about the possibility of a united Ireland someday. Fianna Fáil, Labour, Fine Gael all started addressing it. For the first time ever that I can remember. I mean, before that it had just been this theoretical concept. Yeah, maybe someday it would be nice in theory, but I don't think anybody was really taking it seriously apart from Sinn Féin. And then it was just talking to my colleagues. I was on the Brexit reporting team for the Times. I was covering Ireland. I remember talking to my colleagues and just telling them about the consequences for the Good Friday Agreement. And they were genuinely hearing this for the first time. They hadn't thought about it. And then when they started asking, when in the line of their reporting, asking their contacts in the Tory party, their initial reaction was Ireland will just have to leave as well. And then when it became apparent that Ireland was not going to leave the EU, they went privately, very privately, Northern Ireland's position in the Union came into question, really for the first time since the foundation of the Northern Ireland state. Certainly among the hardline Brexiteers, if it came down to a decision between the pure Brexit they wanted and Northern Ireland staying within the Union, there was only one answer, and that was going to be Brexit, a very pure form of Brexit. Then a few years later, that was just something that I became really interested in, and as Brexit unfolded, it really did go according to textbook in ways, in terms of it was always going to be a binary decision. Are you British? Are you Irish? That shared ground in Northern Ireland had been sundered. And I remember, I'm from Cork originally, we're actually, in a way, I know we're on the same island, but when I was growing up, the North wasn't really part of my experience. I'm married to a woman from Derry. I had spent a lot of time up there, but 2019 was the first time I ever actually saw an orange parade. I can remember I was really shocked by it almost. It's very colourful and it really is. It's striking. But I just started thinking, if there is to be a united Ireland, this is a tradition that is almost diametrically opposed to what our concept of what it means to be Irish. And is it possible to have a united Ireland that is sufficiently malleable that it can embrace these two almost extremes. And then it was about a year later, that's when I contacted Alan. We did actually have that coffee. It was me, I can confirm that, in Dún Laoghaire.
That's good, yeah. And that was in the way the film grew from there. And yeah.
Yeah, talk to me about the goals of the film, though. Okay, so the background, how you guys came together, is interesting. My interpretation, having watched the film, is there's really three phases to the film. There is the lead up, ultimately, which culminates in the Good Friday Accords. The background history from the founding of Northern Ireland all the way up to that point. Obviously, the 30 years of troubles and close to 3,500 deaths, who knows how many people's lives were torn asunder. Then we have Good Friday Accords and the establishment of a representative devolved parliament in Stormont, and then Brexit hits. And so there's a discussion of Brexit, and then on top of that, then there is post-Brexit. So I kind of split it up into the pre-Brexit, post-Brexit, or Good Friday, Brexit, post-Brexit.
Yeah.
What are you trying to do in the film? Because I think it's a very useful film because it lays out that history and reminds it. I grew up during some of it.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think what happened was, as John's outlined it, it was about looking at these questions that John had started to investigate, that most of the rest of us hadn't even thought about. So it was very much looking to the future. What if? How? How would that work? Is it possible? So it was very, at the start, it was very focused on the future, trying to address these questions, that if there was a border poll, what would happen? And if there was a successful border poll, what would a united Ireland look like? How would we manage it economically, culturally, politically, socially, all those things? And that's definitely underpinning the film. One reason we called it The Irish Question is to open it up for people, to provoke thought and conversation and questions, so that we all collectively start to think about what would that thing look like. But gradually, as I got into the film, I realized a couple of things. First of all, that generations younger than us had virtually forgotten the Troubles or didn't know about the Troubles. And also, of course, at some profound level in Northern Ireland, you can't talk about the future without dealing with the past and the trauma and the damage and the kind of psychological destruction that happened. As the film began to take on narrative shape, it seemed to me that as we were looking at these questions about the future, we also had to remind people of where it came from. I've two daughters, both in their 20s, reasonably smart enough, but they really would have had no concept of what happened in our lifetime. And so I felt it was important to kind of weave in a bit of the history along with the discussion on the present and the future.
Yeah, I think that's a really valuable reminder for, as you say, for younger folk that weren't alive or grew up with it, but also for people outside the country looking in that really don't understand a lot of the deeper history. Of course, when you're dealing with Northern Ireland, you can start with the plantation of Ulster.
Yes.
You know, you can go from there, and indeed so many people do.
Yeah. Mark Daly in the film, the senator, refers to that. And I think you're right to talk about, we're here in Washington, and I think you're right to talk about people outside Ireland. I've made a lot of films about Ireland or things Irish, and often you go to festivals or you go places, and the perception of Ireland is very black and white. You all hate the Brits and you just want them gone. And I think if you're involved in any sort of cultural activity, you have to make the truth of the matter, explain it to people. People would presume, as you make a film like this, oh, you hate the Brits. And whereas it's far more complex. As John knows, John lived in London, my sister lived in London. Lots of us grew up with the BBC and Manchester United and the Smiths, and so that kind of simple thing, Brits bad, Irish good, and let's just get rid of them, actually it's clearly far more complex than that.
I will admit, past October was my first time in Belfast. I had grown up in Ireland and left in 1983, and obviously at that point in time, Belfast was not high on the preferred destinations, let's say, if you're in Ireland. We are all children of the Republic. And our lack of immersion, our lack of immediate understanding of the 6 counties or Northern Ireland or the statelet or the whatever we want to call it.
Yeah.
How comfortable are you both in discussing that history, given the fact that you didn't live that history?
Yeah, I'll let John come to that, and he is, as he says, married to a dairy woman.
Yeah, see, in a way, like, that is the key question. Because if you look at it, and certainly all opinion polls would indicate that Fintan O'Toole was very clear and captured this very well in the film. Like, when you ask people in the South, and it's actually what's striking, I find, is like people of all age groups and demographics, they're all, like, there is that, when you just ask them at conceptual level about a united Ireland, there's that kind of warm, fuzzy glow, like it's almost righting a historical wrong. It's inevitable, and it'll happen someday, and it's to be welcomed. It'll be great. What's it going to look like? And if you dig below the surface, it's basically bolting Northern Ireland onto the 26th county republic. There would be opposition to, I think, a new constitution. What I found striking was I spoke to one guy who comes from Sinn Féin royalty. He was very steeped from Dublin, but steeped in Republican politics. His parents are Gael Gores, and I remember talking to him, and he said a few years ago he sat down with him and put it to him. He lives in the US, and it struck him that we are actually now talking about it seriously for the first time, and the chances of it happening are probably greater than not happening. But anyway, he spoke to his parents and he said, what are you prepared to do to give up about this? And they said they would consider a new constitution. They would consider a lot of things. But if there was any threat to the status of the Irish language as the official language of Ireland, like, you could forget it. No way would they vote for a united Ireland. So in a way, we do have a lot of those red lines in the South. And then if you go to the North, and if you look at the history of Northern Ireland, my wife is from Derry, she's a Catholic, and she, by heritage, her grandfather is from Cork. She is Irish, like her DNA is Irish, but yet she would say she very much had a British cultural upbringing. They were inside the 6 counties. They did grow up, they were exposed to BBC, all things British growing up. She was very aware of what was happening in the South and very aware of Irish history and identity as well. So Northern Ireland, it was a very different experience growing up there. And if you asked anybody in Northern Ireland now, from whatever background, what does a united Ireland mean for them? They're going to say very different things to their counterparts in the South.
Yeah.
If there is to be a united Ireland, it would have to be an agreed Ireland. It would have to be a new Ireland, a reimagined one. And I suppose the point, what we're saying with this film is that there's a lot of questions in that, and you're going to have to address an awful lot of really complex and emotional issues. But you need to do that now. You can't do it after a vote. It has to be done well in advance of one, because only then will people know what they're voting for. I'm deeply suspicious of any opinion polls at the moment that show anything. Because I think unless those conversations have been had, that's when you can accurately gauge what sentiment is, because people will know what they're voting for. Before that, I think they're just voting for something that they wish but doesn't really exist.
And also, I think, to come back to your original question about not having been across the border until recently, I think that's so true. I met so many people who haven't been across the border all their life in the South, and vice versa sometimes. And so I think there is a profound ignorance about the North and about the culture there. And in recent years, we've rightly pointed to the kind of Tory London establishment disinterest in the North, and they really don't care. But you could equally point the finger at people in Dublin. Do we really care about what goes on across the border? And I certainly remember during the Troubles travelling up the North, and you go 2 hours up the road and suddenly there's armed soldiers and tanks and checkpoints, and it just seemed so far away and yet so close. And I think a lot of people down south really gave very little thought to the north. And even today, even though obviously it's a very different place, it's a peaceful place, it's a relatively prosperous place, it's a lovely place to visit, there's still a lot of people haven't been across the border. And I think that's a real tragedy, because to a degree the north, both orange and green, has been left in its own bubble. And
Archie, can I just say, I think for me, possibly the most crucial part of this isn't necessarily what's happening in the island of Ireland anymore. It's developments beyond that are forcing this, and that is what is Brexit itself, what it's done to the United Kingdom. Because Brexit largely was a product of English nationalism. We have a number of contributors in the film about this: Gavin Esther, Fintan O'Toole and so on, Philip Stevens. Even the point Philip Stevens made, he's currently associate editor of the FT. But if you look at the structure of the United Kingdom, it's very much a product of the empire. And the empire no longer exists. And in a way, there is a question about the future of the United Kingdom. Is it fit for purpose in the modern era? And certainly given the challenges in the context in which we live. And his answer is no, it's past its sell-by date. Obviously, there's a lot of the Scottish National Party have dipped in the polls recently, but it's largely because of internal problems within the Scottish. It's not because of sentiment towards independence. If you look at opinion polls, they're remarkably durable. They're still around 45%, even though the SNP has gone through a period of absolute turmoil. So that sentiment is there. And I think if Scotland were to go, and Philip Stevens' argument is that it will, it's a matter of time. Not necessarily over the next 5 years, but over the next 10, 15 years. And I think if that were to happen before there's a border poll in Irish unity or whatever, I think, that in a way,
another triggering event.
Well, I mean, in Northern Ireland, Scotland has been a more important pillar of the Union than England itself. Without Scotland, what Union exists? And if you're talking about the Union now, is English nationalism compatible with a functioning United Kingdom? And a lot of people would argue, no, it isn't. They're almost mutually irreconcilable forces. There is a sense that there is a crisis around Unionist identity over the last few years. And for the first time since the foundation of the Northern Ireland state, I think there are valid reasons why there is that profound sense of crisis, because the Union is changing so much. What does it mean to be British anymore? Do English people want to be British? And I'm not sure there is any answer to that yet, because there is a period of flux and it is subject to quite dynamic change. So, yeah, and I mean also, there's one thing I think that was a profound jolt to unionism, and that's since the foundation of the Northern Ireland state in 1921, there's always been paranoia about Northern Ireland's role, how secure was it within the Union. And I think for most of that century up to 2021, or around then, those fears were misplaced. Most, whether Labour or Conservative, there was a deep and abiding commitment to Northern Ireland. There was that deep emotional attachment to the Union. But along came the Boris Johnson's iteration of the Tory party, and it became entirely transactional, populist, and lacking any sort of attachment to the Union. And that was most evident in 2019 when he signed the deal which effectively put a border down the Irish Sea, even though he'd solemnly promised unionists before that under no circumstances would he ever sign such a deal. No, I know he signed it with his fingers tied behind his back, and he'd absolutely no intention of honouring it. But still, the fact that he did it, and a few weeks before it, he was Unionist best friend. Under no circumstances would he ever sell them out. And then, just for the sake of political expediency, he did just that. I think that was very destabilising for unionism. And I think a lot of this is against the backdrop of shifts within unionist sentiment in Northern Ireland and an increasing sense of uncertainty about the union itself.
Yes, the whole thrown under the bus shock that must have been experienced in the unionist community is profoundly unsettling. I've had a member of family visiting there, and I think his take on it was, because he actively sought out engagement on the issue, that the unionist community, largely the fervent unionist community, now feel totally abandoned. That was his take. So a question, and you've alluded to this both, you ask a person from the Republic of Ireland, would you want United Ireland? And pretty much uniformly they will say yes. The first episode actually that we did in the podcast this season featured a gentleman by the name of Paddy Cullivan, who's done a show called I Can't Believe It's Not Ireland, which is supposedly set in 2032 following a border poll. And it's done comedically, and how it played out, which is the question of what are you willing to give up, which you alluded to, John. It's like, okay, with your Sinn Féin royalty family said, well, the Irish language needs to be a central element of a future United Ireland. And Paddy's jokingly version is, okay, let's get rid of the tricolour and replace it with the old Irish harp on a blue background, get rid of the green, white and orange, because that's all about almost enshrining sectarianism. And guess what? We can't have a capital in Dublin, nor can we have it in Belfast, so we'll put it in Athlone.
John would be in favour of Cork.
Yeah, you mean it's not?
But even though it's comedic, it is actually doing a justice to the question by saying, we actually really do have to have a think about this, because there are all these forces boomeranging down upon us. Because when I think of the division of the country originally in 1921, if I'm in north of Ireland, I'm fearful of two things. I am fearful of a theocratic Catholic rule, which is how, in my view, the first 50 years of the Republic of Ireland was dominated by the Catholic Church. Rome ruled fear, and I think that was entirely justified if I was a member of the Protestant community in Northern Ireland. And then there was the economic aspect of things. Belfast at the time, the 1911 census in Belfast, the population of Belfast is actually larger than Dublin. It is booming. You just walk around Belfast and look at the buildings and you can see that late Victorian, early Edwardian buildings. You can see the wealth in that city, and you're like, do I really want to be shackled with this crew down to the south of me who are just totally uneconomically developed? And now it is flipped. And I think it was interesting in the film, you chose to talk about the German experience. But I'm not sure whether it's why it's an interesting issue, because I guess it's the only example we really have in Europe of a reunification taking place. So talk to me a little about that choice and the economic component of this, because that's only one of the many facets to talk about.
There's a lot there. I suppose the German example that we use is more in relation to what John alluded to earlier about the fact that in Germany, West Germany just thought, we'll just take East Germany back, we'll stick it on and everything will be grand. But of course, in the interim time, East Germany had developed its own culture, its own philosophy, its own spirit, in a way, that wasn't respected. And some of the people in the film talk about that there wasn't a willingness in West Germany to appreciate that East Germany had a...
There was some legitimate elements to it.
Absolutely, yeah. And so they realised retrospectively that was wrong. And equally, if there was to be a United Ireland, we have to also appreciate that it's not just a matter of saying, okay, we'll take the 6 counties back and that's grand. We're going to have to accommodate the unionist community and all that brings with it in all its complexities. But of course there's another level, is that there were various young people we talked to, maybe a slowly growing third way, people who don't want to define themselves by orange or green, who are looking at broader pictures that are connected to a global world, connected in some cases to do with climate change, to do with migration, where they want a society that is equal, but is more concerned with, have we got a decent education system, have we got a health system that works, than the kind of the dualism of orange and green. So that is changing. I think the North is changing. I think unionists, though they'd never admit it publicly, they're beginning to look at the possibilities. I don't think, it seems to me, they're not entirely closed to it. In lots of ways, elements of Southern Ireland seem far more attractive than elements of Britain. Britain seems to me to be in complete and utter chaos, maybe slightly stabilised by the Labour government. Not too long ago, you had this kind of buffoonish Tory, ludicrous. Britain felt a couple of years ago like America feels to us now, that it's kind of out of control and tragically dysfunctional. So there are a lot of elements in that. I did sometimes laugh with John, because John has a finer analytic mind, whereas I'm a great man for talking about my feelings. But my feeling...
And your questionable memories?
Yeah, I'm a totally unreliable witness here, but anyway, my feeling, for what it's worth, being up in the North and spending time there and walking around, I think often when you make a film, I find it very useful to spend a lot of time just walking and looking and just feeling the ground. But there's definitely a sadness about that unionist tradition. You can feel that whatever your views on it politically or socially or whatever, to see a culture waning, I imagine the white South Africans probably felt something similar.
Yeah.
And I'm not defending them. To see any culture decline is sad, and I think that's probably inevitable, no matter how inclusive Southern Ireland might try to be in a potential united Ireland. But I think John is right. I think if that is to be a possibility, you have to reimagine it afresh. It's very exciting in a way, because it's certainly not like the south of Ireland is like some sort of idyll. There's a lot of things we could do a lot better. And maybe in an increasingly globalized world, an increasingly integrated Europe, where these borders are not maybe as important as, despite what Brexit did, as we imagined they were, that maybe there's something very exciting in looking at the possibilities together. But there's a huge amount of work and thinking and pain.
Yeah, and I'm glad you raised that. I had the pleasure of sitting in on a discussion between Fintan O'Toole and Martin Doyle about his book, Dirty Linen, which is an extraordinary book, and it just talks about looking at the Northern Ireland lens through the tragedies in one parish, which I think was a really interesting thing. But in the course of that conversation, Martin said what was lacking in the Good Friday Accord was a Truth and Reconciliation Committee, something along the lines of South Africa. So we're not trying to punish people, but we are trying to get that history out, because you cannot heal people, or you cannot, it's not even you're going to heal, you'll never heal people that had a family member shot in front of them, or somebody who's had their limbs blown off. They carry that for the rest of their life. But unless you do the work to acknowledge those pains and recognize the wrongness of that, you can't hope to begin to form peace. And the other thing I've seen playing out in New York and also in Ireland, the Future of Ireland folks, they're pushing along this line, and I sat down with some of them, and they're like, yeah, we need to have a border poll by 2030. I was like, hold on. We're still dealing with smarting wounds who are 25 years later, but the wounds are still fresh for many people. And guess what? Some of that pain is transferred into the new generation automatically. How do we even consider having a border poll until we have truth and reconciliation? To me, that's a fundamental building block, but I don't know, is that congruent with how you would think?
If one of the reasons, there's a number of reasons why unionists would say no to a united Ireland. One, most fundamentally, is that a lot of them would say, my identity is British. That is completely irreconcilable with a united Ireland, no matter what shape you put it in. New Ireland, Great Ireland, whatever terminology, I'm British, that's my identity. I can't ever see myself within a united Ireland. But obviously there's different shades within unionism. But there's one thing that would make, I think, all unionists vote no if there is a referendum, and if there was any sense of triumphalism from the Republican tradition. Because then it feeds into fears about what life would be like for them in a united Ireland. Is there a possibility of second-class citizenry? Well, that sort of thing. That's why legacy, trauma, all these things have to be addressed, because I don't think without those, you've got a really proper narrative of the Troubles. It's never going to be accepted by everybody, but is sufficiently recognised that you can move on and say, look, this is what happened in the past, but this is what we're trying to do with the future. And there's also another point I'd like to make about when you mentioned Irish American and so on. If you look at the Good Friday Agreement, the Good Friday Agreement would not have happened without Tony Blair and Bill Clinton working very closely with Bertie Ahern. That was crucial to the underpinning of the Good Friday Agreement. Now, on this occasion, Labour is in government in the UK, and they're bringing a lot more stability. Hilary Benn, I think since he's become the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, has been very impressive. He's a deep understanding of Northern Ireland, something that's been lacking in almost every Secretary of State for the last, under the previous Tory administrations, apart from Julian Smith, who was very good. But the rest of them didn't seem to understand or care about Northern Ireland. I think Hilary Benn is doing a very good job. But if you look at the opposition in the UK at the moment, the Tories are just turning into this radical right populist party. The Reform Party is an English national party. I think English politics is quite volatile. And I think if there is to be a referendum, you need stability in London. It has to be, you need an honest broker in London. Otherwise, the potential to backfire is very high. And I also think that if you look at what's happening in the US, can you imagine a border poll with Donald Trump in the White House? It's not going to happen in that time frame. If he does serve just 4 years or
14 years.
But if you look at the current trajectory of the Republican Party, at best they would take absolutely no interest at all. But I don't think you're going to have the same guiding hand by Irish Americans. I know there's still very prominent Irish American leaders, the likes of Richard Neal and Brendan Boyle, and so on. But I don't know if you're going to get that leadership in the White House again. I could be wrong. There's always pendulums in these things. It could swing back towards a Democrat administration at some stage in the future that's quite well disposed to Ireland again. At the moment, it's just hard to see that. So a lot of the foundations that were there for the signing of the Good Friday Agreement and did a lot of the important legwork, they're missing now. And I don't know if they will be there in the future.
Yeah, I think there's an alignment of things that happened to make the Good Friday Agreement possible. But just going back to this truth and reconciliation, it feels like to me, and there's a poignant moment when you show in the film the graves of Paisley, of Trimble, of John Hume and Martin McGuinness, who are all significant players. Some committed to the armed struggle, some committed to, let's call it a provocative version of unionism, and some committed to peace. And one of the things that occurred to me is that we can't even hope to have order until all of that generation are no longer with us. That enough time has to pass because these people were the standard bearers of the conflict, and many of them accrued great power on the back of the conflict or a notoriety. But talk about the choice of that particular scene. It really struck me.
I'm aware it's a kind of odd scene. And I think maybe it came from, I talked about spending a bit of time and wandering around and walked around Derry a lot, which I didn't know really. And so I think I got a notion that Hume was such a huge figure in all this that I should pay my respects and we should include his grave. And then I thought, for some reason, I like graveyards. So I then got a notion that I'd visit all the graves of Trimble and Paisley and McGuinness And they're very moving. And when you remember the magnificence of the Good Friday Agreement and all the kind of excitement, and then Hume and Trimble, of course, who gets forgotten, getting the Peace Prize. And so there was something in just that human frailty that now they're dead, that big moment and they're gone. But it was one of those things sometimes in a film that aren't entirely rational. I felt it was appropriate to visit them. I think there's something in time passing in history, and something about that no matter what you achieve or don't achieve in your life, things move on. Northern Ireland is moving on, it is changing. And I also kind of liked just the simple act of paying your respects. The film in some way was paying their respects to these people regardless. And I remember being particularly struck at Paisley's grave. I wouldn't have that much now, in fairness, with Ian Paisley. But there was something very poignant about this great bellowing kind of figure, and he was there in this kind of lonely piece of Ulster. And sometimes in films, I think the image just speaks for itself in all its ambiguity, rather than me necessarily knowing what I'm doing.
It worked on me, but I think, it leaves it open to an interpretation.
And I think there is something in that passage of time, and I think the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, I think the people who signed that knew, let's just get it over the line, let's just get peace, and then we'll sort out the mess afterwards. And so I think everybody involved, they weren't naive, they knew it hasn't happened. I think probably Brexit messed with that a bit, that they knew there needs to be a process of accommodating the past and accommodating the violence and the death and the trauma. And I think somebody said in the film that after the Good Friday Agreement, but pre-Brexit, Northern Ireland was just finding its feet as a place in itself, that as a community of itself, including all the diverse political beliefs, that it was finding its feet as a place. And then Brexit blew that apart. And I think had it not been maybe for Brexit, that the next phase of working together in Northern Ireland as a community of people, the next stage might have been, they would have been ready maybe to enter a sort of truth and reconciliation. And again, I think that's been one of the casualties of Brexit.
Okay, let me flip this on its end and talk about Brexit as an advantage, as a border in the Irish Sea, an economic advantage, because now we have these 6 counties which have a foot in both the UK. Admittedly, the UK economy is not in great shape right now. The question remains to be seen whether it will emerge from that, from what I believe is a tragic economic mistake, that is Brexit. But they also have a foot in the EU. Does that give them some kind of advantage that is worth preserving that community?
Yeah, one of the contributors in the film said economics is one thing, but people should not decide this on the basis of economics, and that is true. However, economics is going to have a huge bearing on the success or otherwise, if it ever happens, or will it happen? For theoretically, you're right, what we have now, the Windsor framework, does give Northern Ireland theoretically the best of both worlds. So in that case, why would you vote for United Ireland when you've got access to the EU and you've got access to the British market? But I think, and certainly that is an important consideration, but I think a more important consideration will be what happens to the future of the British economy itself post-Brexit. It's really struggling at the moment, and it's very unclear where future growth is going to come from. So if that is the case, and I mean, there's one of the people I spoke to made the point that from a unionist background, and said the reason he wanted a border poll, a referendum, was not he would be voting to remain in the union no matter what, but he wanted that as a sort of way of bringing focus back onto Northern Ireland, because for years it's just been allowed atrophy by various governments in London. They get the subvention every year and that's it. Northern Ireland gets its money, it's used to pay for social services, this, that and the other thing, but it's just like getting by. It isn't growing there's been never any serious thought into the economic development of Northern Ireland. What does it stand for? If the British economy continues to really struggle, where's that money going to come from in the future? You're just going to have increasing pressure on the annual subvention. But equally, Ireland is doing extremely well at the moment. The Irish economy is roaring ahead. But that's largely on the basis of a thriving foreign direct investment flow into Ireland, mainly US multinationals. And if Donald Trump does follow through and he's pledged to bring a lot of those manufacturing, particularly pharmaceutical manufacturing, back to the US, that would be a huge blow to the Irish economy. And if that were to happen, it's very hard to see how the South could afford a united Ireland. While economics probably shouldn't be the primary consideration, it's a very important one. And certainly you need a good economy to smooth over the inevitable differences that would happen if there were a united Ireland at some stage.
I think the notion of unification without pain is not realistic. And one of the things that we tried to do in our Lost in Belfast podcast series was try to switch the story around Northern Ireland, because for many people that have not been there before, the first thing they think about Northern Ireland when they think about it, bombs. And so we wanted to shift that and to communicate the importance for people to actually go visit the place and to start experiencing that. And I think there's lots of work that has to be done, truth and reconciliation, just simple visiting, understanding the culture, etc., before we can even begin to consider that. But this has been a fascinating conversation, and I would love to have kept going for another hour. But there are other things to do and fish to fry. So on behalf of myself and our listeners, I'd like to thank both John Walsh and Alan Gilsenan for taking the time out to talk about their wonderful film, The Irish Question. Make sure you see it. It will educate and it will stimulate. And what more can you ask from a great film?
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks so much.
Really enjoyed the conversation.
And I do also totally reiterate what you said. Northern Ireland's a wonderful place, and just go there and enjoy it. And then we can talk about it. Today we've been talking about a lot of the issues and the problems and the challenges. There's also great stuff and great energy and great people.
A big thank you to John Walsh and Alan Gilsenan for the opportunity to have such an in-depth discussion about their film, The Irish Question. The film reintroduces difficult history, which is either new to some viewers or, in my case, faded. It affords an opportunity and a space to examine what a united Ireland might look like, given the impact of Brexit and more than 25 years of fragile peace. As such, the film works both as a healthy public service and a work of art, encouraging all Irish communities to work more closely together towards a new vision of Ireland, where the sorrows of the past can be recognised and future generations can step forward away from ancient animosities. We'll be back next week with a new episode from our Lost in Belfast series. This time we'll be featuring multi-talented vocalist Suzanne Savage, who we heard live at the Duncairn Centre in Linonopolis. Until then, this is Martin Nutty, and you've been listening to the Irish Stew podcast. Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.